The boardroom was a polished arena of egos, where suits measured value in applause rather than outcomes, and my boss relished every second of attention. He strutted to the center like a performer confident that his jokes were already funny. When he finally gestured toward me, he didn't bother with introductions or titles. He jabbed a finger as if identifying defective equipment and labeled me the tech guy. No acknowledgement of the decade I spent building the digital backbone that kept the Texas data center breathing. To him, I was a replaceable component, not the architect who made sure billions in transactions crossed our systems without a single skipped heartbeat. He launched into a presentation that overflowed with bright graphics and hollow promises. He dismissed years of tested infrastructure as museum pieces and mocked the engineers who had protected the company from cyber attacks, power failures, and federal audits. He claimed modern leadership required bold moves, not planning, not security, just speed. With theatrical pride, he announced his grand idea, moving the entire ecosystem to the cloud in 90 days. The board erupted into applause as if he had cured disease, ignoring the legal, financial, and logistical nightmares we were about to face. I attempted to raise concerns about compliance requirements during such a migration, including data residency laws and encryption standards. He waved me off mid-sentence, as though my expertise was an inconvenience he was obligated to endure. He smirked, saying that real leaders don't ask for permission. The board chuckled, happily swept into his fantasy of progress without consequence. Not one of them understood that such carelessness doesn't create innovation, it creates liabilities. Then he delivered the final blow. In front of the executives, he ordered me to provide him full administrator access to the core systems, framing it as a necessary step for his revolution. He interpreted my silence as acceptance, but silence can be many things: calculation, observation, and sometimes the quiet acknowledgement that a fire has already been lit. He believed power came from access. I knew power came from understanding, and he possessed none. By the time the meeting ended, the applause had faded, but his recklessness remained. He thought he had taken control of a system he barely comprehended. I recognized something he didn't. Some leaders ignite change, others ignite disasters. His arrogance had struck the match. The flames were coming. He just hadn't noticed the smoke yet. The moment I configured his credentials, he behaved like a man who believed buttons existed only to be pressed. He never once paused to understand why certain options were locked behind warnings or why a system required 3 confirmations before executing a command. He moved through the control panel as though navigating a television menu. Certain confidence was equivalent to competence. His first action was to disable network redundancies that protected the data center during outages. When I asked why, he claimed that backup lines encourage laziness, as if stability were a character flaw. Within hours, he ventured deeper into areas reserved for senior engineers, areas where changes required documentation and oversight. He deleted storage snapshots containing critical historical records, convinced they were unnecessary duplicates. He didn't grasp that those snapshots were our insurance against corruption, ransomware, and regulatory audits. Each deletion erased months of protective scaffolding. He saw himself as eliminating clutter. I saw him removing the fire exits. Next, he turned his attention to server partitions. He merged them without analyzing traffic loads or peak time behavior. For him, it was a simple toggle. For the infrastructure, it was dismantling load balancing systems that prevented crashes during high-volume transactions. He believed simplicity made systems better. He didn't understand that complexity was the price of resilience. Then came the most dangerous change. He disabled automated failsafes designed to shut down overheated processors. The logs showed him clicking through warning prompts without reading a single line. He bragged to nearby employees that engineers exaggerated risks to justify fancy salaries. He spoke as if technology must obey ego. Technology obeys math, physics, and thermodynamics, rules he had no interest in learning. I monitored the logs from my workstation, watching each modification like a surgeon observing someone swinging an axe in an operating room. None of his actions were intentionally malicious. They were worse. They were ignorant decisions protected by authority. He walked through the system like a man convinced the foundation of a skyscraper existed only for decoration. He believed access was power. He didn't realize access was responsibility. Every unchecked command weakened a structure whose survival depended on precision. He wasn't sabotaging the data center. He was simply removing what made it safe. Gravity doesn't negotiate. It waits. His ideas no longer floated inside the boardroom. They tumbled recklessly into every department like unsecured cargo. He rushed through hallways with the confidence of a man who believed complexity was simply a lack of willpower. His grand plan was to migrate the company's entire financial infrastructure, decades of transaction history, classified records, contract archives, and regulatory documentation, into a cloud service he discovered through a YouTube advertisement. He even bragged that if a platform had over 1 million views, it had to be trustworthy. The engineers stared in disbelief. He confused popularity with security, marketing with architecture, and convenience with legality. He presented the migration timeline to the leadership team as if unveiling a gift. 90 days, he claimed, would be enough time to dismantle on-premise protections, relocate all critical datasets, and launch a new era of efficiency. He didn't include encryption keys, compliance checkpoints, or external audits in the schedule. He called these frills designed by technicians who lacked imagination. He didn't realize those frills were shields that had kept the company out of courtrooms and news headlines. The cybersecurity officer, a woman who had spent her career navigating federal regulations, attempted to challenge him. She calmly explained that financial data was subject to strict oversight, data sovereignty, retention requirements, encryption standards, and penalties that could cripple firms for a single violation. He waved his hand dismissively and labeled her dramatic, as though preventing lawsuits was an emotional problem. His words drained the room of confidence. The staff understood the danger. Only he believed safeguards were optional. His plan didn't include vendor evaluations, penetration tests, or compliance certifications. He had no understanding that many cloud providers were structured for hobbyists, not enterprises with billions in capital exposure. He didn't request risk assessments. He didn't analyze data traffic or system dependencies. He moved forward as if the cloud were infinite, trustworthy, and immune to failure. He spoke of speed as if speed alone produced value. The board liked speed, shareholders liked the illusion of savings. He confused applause for validation. During weekly meetings, he boasted about cutting legacy fat, unaware that the so-called fat was muscle, structures that managed power loads, redundancy cycles, and encryption lifelines. He treated infrastructure like outdated furniture that could be discarded without consequence. Engineers attempted to provide reports outlining the dangers. He dismissed every document longer than 1 page, claiming that innovation should be readable in a headline. Headlines don't hold systems together. Protocols do. He began instructing departmental leaders to export databases and relocate them into the cloud environment without encryption. I watched legal teams panic when they realized contracts containing confidential data were being transferred across borders without compliance review. Regulatory officers warned him about the potential consequences. The penalties weren't hypothetical, they were measured in millions. He shrugged and said that regulators moved slowly while he moved fast. He didn't see that speed without direction leads to cliffs. Soon, data streams began failing. Authentication systems hiccuped as files rewritten in incompatible formats struggled to communicate with on-premise applications. Account managers couldn't reconcile records. Vendors called to report missing statements. The infrastructure that once functioned like a choreographed engine now groaned like machinery held together by hope alone. He interpreted these failures as resistance. He believed people were sabotaging him, not that his plan was built on fantasy. He wasn't migrating data. He was evacuating foundations. He didn't see the sky. He only saw the clouds painted on the ceiling. Friday evenings usually signaled the gradual quieting of the data center, a transition from corporate urgency to the predictable hum of machines performing their nocturnal routines. But that night was different. He arrived with the swagger of someone convinced greatness was inevitable. He stood before the engineers and announced that the final migration would happen over the weekend and that he alone would supervise it. He spoke as if unveiling a miracle, not understanding miracles rarely begin with locked doors and disabled logins. Within minutes, he ordered everyone out of the server room, dismissing decades of combined expertise with a flick of his hand. He disabled my credentials with a smirk, convinced that preventing access meant preventing interference. He believed knowledge was a threat instead of a safeguard. The security panel beeped as he restricted access across the board, sealing himself inside the heart of an infrastructure he barely understood. He acted as though technical mastery was instinct, not earned through years of failures, documentation, and brutal persistence. He didn't want witnesses. He wanted credit. As the last employee exited, the building lights dimmed in their energy-saving cycle, casting long shadows across racks of hardware. To me, the sudden darkness felt like anticipation, as if the system itself sensed what was coming. Machines don't fear consequences, but systems are built to detect anomalies. Something in that silent architecture recognized the impending assault better than the man who initiated it. By midnight, he sat before the terminal like a king assuming command of an empire. Without a checklist, verification process, or even a backup snapshot, he initiated bulk transfer protocols. His fingers danced recklessly, issuing commands that bypassed safety confirmations and disabled safeguards designed to catch user errors. He wasn't migrating data, he was rewriting identities, financial, corporate, and operational. Entire structures that defined clients, employees, vendors, and investors were overwritten, stripped of relational context, and cast into a virtual void. The first error logs appeared within minutes, flashing warnings he ignored. Instead of halting to understand, he interpreted them as obstacles created by those he called legacy thinkers. He disabled the alert notifications, convinced alarms merely reflected outdated caution. His actions unleashed cascading failures. Authentication requests began looping without resolution. Financial clusters attempted to reconcile missing parent records and crashed under contradictory commands. Transaction engines froze, unable to confirm data integrity. He mistook silence for progress. Cooling systems activated, trying to manage the thermal load generated by servers straining under nonsensical operations. But with redundancies disabled earlier in the week, the infrastructure had no safety nets. Heat built faster than processors could handle. Components throttled, then overheated. The blinking lights across server racks changed from green to amber, then red, like an industrial heartbeat losing rhythm. He didn't notice. He paced the room, congratulating himself, rehearsing future interviews he imagined the media would line up to conduct. He poured a drink from a flask he hid in his jacket and toasted the darkened room as if celebrating a victory no one else understood. He believed completion was proof of success. He didn't grasp that completion without validation is collapse disguised as achievement. Outside the server room, support staff watched error tickets multiply like storm clouds. Anxious messages circulated through internal channels, but no one could intervene. Access had been revoked. Everyone knew something irreversible was happening. He believed isolation protected his authority. In reality, isolation removed the last barriers between mistakes and consequences. He thought he was reshaping the future. He was dismantling the present. He thought he was playing God. The system had already begun writing his obituary. Monday morning arrived with a kind of chaos that doesn't knock, it barges in. The phones began screaming before sunrise, alerts stacking faster than anyone could read them. Partner banks across the country couldn't access transaction histories. Their systems, which depended on our data center like organs depend on oxygen, showed only blank screens. Payroll departments called next frantic because workers from coast to coast had no record of earnings. Direct deposits failed. The scheduled transfers that once ran flawlessly now dissolved into nothingness. What had been the financial bloodstream of multiple industries suddenly carried no pulse. Shipping operations came next. Warehouses that relied on automated confirmations stood paralyzed. Trucks sat loaded but without destination codes. Inventory systems looped endlessly, unable to verify orders or locations. The Texas data center, once a monument of precision, blinked on and off like a heart entering cardiac arrest. The blinking stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. Nothing moved. Nothing reconciled. The digital world that once hummed with certainty now sounded like a morgue. In boardrooms and offices, panic became the dominant language. Executives who once applauded bold transformation now whispered about liabilities, lawsuits, and resignations. Customer service lines crashed under the weight of outrage. Clients threatened legal action for breaches of contract, non-delivery, and lost funds. Some accused the company of fraud. Others accused us of incompetence. All demanded answers we didn't have. Confidence vanished in hours, replaced by fear that decades of reputation had been erased over a weekend. Then federal agents arrived, not with accusations, but with questions the company was legally required to answer. Where was the data? Who authorized the migration? Why were safeguards disabled? What compliance measures were ignored? My boss, now pale and sweating, tried to offer explanations. Each sentence crumbled under scrutiny. Federal regulations don't care about ambition. They care about evidence, and evidence showed someone had dismantled the very mechanisms meant to protect customers and partners. My boss rushed into the server room, convinced the issue lay in a simple misconfiguration. He attempted to reverse commands he never understood, toggling options like a gambler pushing random buttons on a slot machine. Every attempted repair triggered a cascade of new errors. When he restored one feature, another destabilized. When he attempted to recover deleted partitions, the system rejected him. Fail-safes were gone. Redundancies he removed no longer existed. He was fighting a collapsing structure with tools he never learned to use. Hours turned into a nightmare. Engineers were summoned, but their access had been revoked. They could only watch from the outside, powerless to intervene. He called vendors, consultants, and anyone whose number he could find. No one could help because no one understood the labyrinth he had created while pretending to innovate. He blamed others. The collapse wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was an implosion, slow, merciless, irreversible. Servers overheated, authentication loops spiraled, and data integrity checks failed. The company wasn't dying, it had already died. Only the paperwork remained to confirm the time of death. He didn't destroy the company. He simply removed the hands that once held it together. Now, the wreckage was his masterpiece. And gravity was only halfway done. The collapse of the Texas data center had already crippled operations, but the true reckoning began when the auditors arrived. They didn't move with panic or emotion. They walked through hallways like surgeons preparing for an autopsy. Their briefcases contained regulations, federal codes, and procedures thicker than any corporate handbook. Where executives saw disaster, auditors saw an opportunity to dissect failure with precision. They demanded access to system logs, backup reports, and administrative records. No one argued. Fear had drained the room of courage. What they uncovered was not merely negligence, it was traceable destruction. Every unauthorized change had a digital fingerprint. His administrator login sat proudly at the top of every log file, attached to commands he executed without understanding. Each click became a confession. His timestamps created a map of arrogance in chronological order. The very tools meant to protect him exposed him. Technology may forgive delays, but it never forgets actions. The board convened emergency meetings, expecting to negotiate penalties or craft explanations. Instead, they were confronted with evidence that left them speechless. The man they once hailed as a visionary now appeared as a saboteur with a job title. They couldn't look at him directly. The applause that once fueled his ego had evaporated. Silence formed a wall he could not climb. He tried to mount a defense. He claimed he had inherited a broken system. He argued that old staff sabotaged his modernization effort. He hinted that I had intentionally withheld information. But logs don't lie, and Arrogance doesn't print receipts, it prints evidence. Every accusation he made collapsed under forensic scrutiny. My access had been revoked before the changes began, and the timestamps proved he executed commands long after everyone else left the building. His words turned into dust before they could land. The investigators' expressions shifted the moment they discovered the most damaging entry. He had erased federally protected data during the migration. He didn't understand that retention rules weren't friendly guidelines, they were legal anchors. The deletion violated federal statutes requiring financial records to be preserved for audits and dispute resolution. He called it optimizing usage. Regulators called it tampering with protected data. The auditors didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. They simply stopped asking questions and opened folders labeled charges. Federal agents returned, this time with different posture and tone. They didn't want explanations. They wanted accountability. Executives who once avoided me now begged for clarification. They wanted to know whether the damage could be reversed. They wanted guarantees, not apologies. I explained calmly that recovery was possible, but it required time, access, and cooperation, 3 things my boss had burned like kindling. He watched as the company that had once believed his every word now treated him like a contaminant. Colleagues refused to sit near him. Directors whispered about resignations and lawsuits. Insurance providers demanded immediate reports. Partners requested written assurances. The audit had shifted the narrative. His confidence was no longer admired. It was documented incompetence. The auditors submitted a preliminary report summarizing the disaster, unauthorized system modifications, disabled protections, deletion of mandatory records, and noncompliance with federal data regulations. Each item had a name next to it, his name. Not mine. Not the engineer's. His. For the first time since arriving at the company, he didn't speak. Arrogance thrives on applause, and now there was none. His silence wasn't remorse, it was suffocation. The audit didn't merely reveal what happened. It revealed who did it. And in corporate warfare, identity is the sharpest blade. The request came early, before most employees had settled into their desks. His assistant, usually brisk and dismissive, appeared at my door looking pale, her voice stripped of its usual superiority. She asked me to come to his office immediately. There was no condescension in her tone this time, only urgency. I walked through hallways filled with whispers, employees following news alerts, and internal messages that confirmed the company's freefall. The confident stride my boss once displayed had vanished from the building. Chaos had taken its place. When I entered his office, the transformation was stark. Gone was the polished executive who delivered grand speeches and mocked seasoned professionals. He sat hunched behind his desk, surrounded by documents he no longer knew how to interpret. Legal threats, investigative notices, and regulatory demands formed a barricade around him. Every sheet of paper was a reminder of a decision he once celebrated. Now, those same decisions held the power to dismantle everything he valued. He didn't greet me with false authority. He didn't try to mask fear with arrogance. He simply gestured to the chair in front of him, as though inviting a judge rather than an employee. His voice trembled when he spoke, the confidence that once fueled his leadership gone without a trace. He tried to explain the situation, calling it a misunderstanding, as if the destruction of core infrastructure, the deletion of federally protected data, and the paralysis of entire industries could be reduced to miscommunication. His words were clumsy, and his excuses collapsed under their own weight. He leaned forward, almost whispering, and asked whether I could help undo what had happened. He needed solutions, not theories. He needed execution, not applause. The same man who once dismissed me as the tech guy now pleaded for the expertise he had mocked. Titles meant nothing in that moment. He needed the mind he had ignored. He sought not my presence, but my competence, the very competence he once saw as an obstacle to his ambitions. I didn't match his panic. I didn't remind him of the warnings he ignored. I didn't list the procedures he bypassed. I didn't need to. The wreckage surrounding him spoke louder than any accusation could. His office, once a stage for bold declarations, had turned into an evidence chamber of irresponsibility. When I finally responded, I kept my tone calm and clear. "You fired the safety net," I told him, "and now you expect the fall to feel soft." The silence that followed was not the silence of disbelief, it was the silence of recognition. He lowered his eyes, no longer able to maintain the illusion that charisma was a substitute for knowledge. He asked whether the systems could be restored. I outlined the reality. Some components were recoverable, but others were permanently lost. Compliance records, transactional histories, and encrypted archives had been overridden beyond repair. His decisions had not merely damaged operations, they had altered the company's identity. For a moment, he looked like a man searching for a crack in the consequences, a hidden exit from accountability. But there was none. The collapse had a signature, and it belonged to him. He nodded slowly, absorbing the truth he had resisted for far too long. He didn't argue. He didn't deny. He simply understood. As I stood to leave, his voice broke once more. "Don't let this be the end," he whispered. I paused, not out of sympathy, but because endings aren't defined by failure, they're defined by what follows it. Whether his story ended here was no longer my burden. It was his. For the first time, he finally looked at me. But it was too late. Revenge has a reputation for being an action, a dramatic strike delivered at the perfect moment. People imagine sabotage, secret plots, whispered schemes. But sometimes, the most devastating revenge requires no movement at all, only patience. I didn't sabotage him. I didn't report him. I didn't raise my voice or rally allies. I simply stepped aside and allowed gravity to do what pride had already guaranteed. His downfall was not a battle I won, it was a collapse he engineered. After the audit confirmed every critical decision bore his signature, the board abandoned him faster than a sinking ship sheds passengers. They needed a savior, not a scapegoat. Suddenly, I was no longer the tech guy. I became the architect who understood the arteries of the company. They didn't ask if I wanted to return. They asked how quickly I could rebuild. I didn't negotiate a job. I negotiated a contract. A consulting rate triple my old salary, approved without hesitation. It was the first time the board understood value in terms of expertise rather than charisma. The Texas data center, once a source of pride, had become an exposed wound. Under my supervision, reconstruction wasn't merely technical, it was strategic. I worked with engineers who understood caution better than applause. We restored redundancies, rebuilt. As we repaired the infrastructure, news of his failure spread beyond corporate walls. Industry forums dissected his decisions. Analysts cited the collapse as a case study in leadership gone wrong. Investors demanded statements. Partners severed ties. Competitors used our disaster to emphasize their superiority. He tried to reframe the narrative by accusing others, but logs don't bend to ego and regulations don't sympathize with excuses. His lawyer became his closest confidant, though even legal counsel couldn't reconstruct credibility. The board never publicly blamed him. They didn't need to. Silence became his indictment. Stripped of influence, he attended meetings where no one acknowledged his comments. Decisions moved around him like he wasn't even in the room. His title remained intact, but the authority beneath it evaporated. Every passing day added another brick to the invisible wall separating him from relevance. Meanwhile, my influence expanded. Departments previously blocked by his arrogance now collaborated freely. Teams once stifled by his certainty now contributed ideas without fear. The company regained movement, not because of a miracle, but because it finally respected the systems that supported it. I didn't become a hero. I became a necessity, and necessity outranks ego every time. He watched all of it from the same chair where he once mocked me. The irony didn't escape him. That chair, once a throne, had become a vantage point to observe the consequences of his own decisions. He didn't lose power in a dramatic coup. He surrendered it, one unchecked assumption at a time. When he finally resigned, no one gasped. No one tried to stop him. The office door closed quietly, as if the building itself refused to honor his exit with sound. People later asked how I felt watching his career dissolve. They expected satisfaction, vindication, perhaps triumph. I felt none of those things. He dug the pit. He misread the terrain. All I did was avoid falling in with him. His downfall wasn't my revenge. It was his reflection, proof that arrogance doesn't need an enemy. It only needs a mirror. Some leaders build companies. Others build graves with their ego. He just never realized which one he was digging.